Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gapesta here. This is Heroic Shadowlord Iskar. This fight is somewhat interesting. You're fighting this bird boss, dealing with a number of adds, quite a few mechanics going on, but the main goal of the fight is to deal with the boss and many of his mechanics using the Eye of Anzu, which is a special single item that essentially is held by one player in the raid and can be passed around to other raid members. And holding this will confer various benefits to the player that's holding it. And using this is necessary to deal with some of the mechanics from the boss and the adds throughout the fight. So let's begin by talking about positioning, which is pretty critical to this fight. Most of the positioning is designed around two basic abilities, which are used commonly. The Chakram, which targets 3 players in the raid frequently, and the laser fire beam, which targets 1 player but leaves trails of fire. So, like all the diagrams that I've done in the past, this is just the example that of the strategy we're using. The overview here shows colored rings, so a circle with a hole in the middle, which indicates the raid marker of that particular color. So the important ones are the 4 on the outside. We have green to the left, which is the Fel Chakram point for the ranged player. The purple one at the top, which is the Chakram point for the melee. Red marker on the right, Chakram point for the tank. And the orange marker for the stack position, which is for all the ranged and healers hang out. Then in the center, of course, you have the tanks and melee with the boss. You don't really need 2 raid markers, but 1 is sufficient, but we use 2 just for our own purposes. So basically keep these 4 to 5 points in mind as we go through the rest of the guide here. So as mentioned at the top, the core mechanic of this fight, the gimmick, is the Eye of Anzu, which is the singular buff that 1 player will hold at all times, and you pass around to the raid. And to deal with this mechanic, you can pass it legitimately using an extra action button, just clicking on raid members in your raid frame. But I would highly, highly recommend getting the Iskar Assist Addon when you're first learning this fight in particular. It will assist your entire raid group, keep everyone on the same page. It makes management of this a lot easier. It's just a great tool. So there's a link to the download of this add-on in the description. And I'm not going to say it's required. You can do the fight without it. If you choose to do it without the add-on, you can use the macro you see on screen to essentially mouse over a player. And when you hit that macro, it will pass the eye using your extra action button. Then it will retarget your previous target. But I would not recommend that at all. The add-on is much better in every way. You can see on the screen, the left side there, that big list of players. If you do grab it, I would suggest making sure that everyone in the raid is on the same page in terms of its setup. The main thing you want to ensure is that you configure it to list players in the same order. I believe at the time of this video, there are 2 ways you can do it, either alphabetically, which is how our raid chose to do it, or you can do it by group. Alphabetically is just easier when people need to, find someone by name, obviously. So if you have someone helping out, calling in your mumble or whatever, your voice chat, pass it to this person. It's a lot easier to do that when it's alphabetical. On the other hand, it's technically more efficient to deal with some of the mechanics, namely the wind, which we'll talk about in a moment. Wind players are ordered by group because you would generally put your melee and tank players in the first group or 2 of the raid, and these people would get precedent or priority of getting the eye buff when they're being pushed off the platform by the winds. Again, we'll talk about these mechanics in a moment, but that's the first and main thing to consider. So everyone in your raid should grab this add-on. Make sure it's large enough as well. You can configure the height and the width and all that stuff. We've had many times where players just didn't have the frame big enough, or they freaked out when they got the thing and tried to quickly click on the person they were supposed to pass it to, ended up clicking the wrong target. So generally speaking, it's okay to make this pretty large on your screen so that you won't screw it up. But use of it is very simple. You can, check the add-on page, obviously, but the main thing you need to know is that you can left-click on the name of the player in the add-on, pass it to them, and if you right-click and you're a healer, you can dispel as well. So that's pretty much the basics of it. Again, highly recommend getting this add-on because it will just ease the learning of this fight a great deal for the entire group. And if somebody in your raid doesn't have it, they're going to have a much more difficult time dealing with the passing when the majority of the raid does have it. So make sure everybody has this. So getting into the mechanics of the fight, we start in the ground phase. We initially engage. You're in the ground phase, fighting against the boss by himself. Also make sure when you start the fight, you quickly have someone pick up the Eye of Anzu, which is sitting on the ground in front of the boss. While you're in the ground phase here, you're dealing with just the boss's mechanics, the most common of which is Fel Chakram. I used it just a moment ago, and when he's using this, he will debuff 3 players in the raid. These 3 players are the current tank, or his threat on the boss, and then 1 random ranged player, so ranged DPS or healer, and 1 random melee DPS player. So tank, a melee, and a ranged all get selected. The tank is the only one that's not randomized. You can see there the chakram is thrown out to the back, then it goes to the right, then behind or below me toward red, back to the boss. So the way it works is of those 3 players, after their debuff expires, the boss throws his chakram, starting with the ranged player first. So that's always the first target that gets thrown toward. Melee player then has a chakram bounce from the range to the melee, hits the melee player, then it bounces from melee to the tank player, and from the tank it goes back to the boss. So it travels in that order every single time. Because of this is the main reason that you have those 3 markers that I mentioned in the position section. For us, we had the ranged marker, the green one on the left, the melee one, the purple on the back, the red tank one on the right. And then keeping the boss sort of in the center point of that, with melee DPS behind the boss and ranged DPS on the other side of the boss, it ensures that the boss throws the chakram out to his right, toward green, to hit the ranged player first. This means the chakram will not pass through anybody else because the melee are behind the boss, the tanks are in front. So it's going out to the sides. Then it goes to purple. So from green to purple, doesn't hit anyone. From purple to red, doesn't hit anyone extra. And finally back to the boss from red, again going into his left side. So just like when it exited from the right, it doesn't hit anybody extra. The chakram itself, when it hits a player, it does moderate damage to them, but it also does damage to the entire raid. But this damage is reduced the further that other players are from the impact position, from the point that the player is standing. So this is the other reason that you have these positions for those players out to the sides. So when chakram debuffs go out, those 3 people run out. So there you can see the range in the bottom left, the melee one's in the back, the tank went to the right. And they just quickly go out to their general direction or point, get as far as they can. The chakram is thrown. It bounces in the 3-pronged pattern, goes back to the boss, and those people are then free to move back once the throw has actually hit their position. So it's a long explanation, but hopefully you can see, just from the footage and the diagram, how the mechanic is supposed to work so it doesn't hit anybody extra as it goes around the pattern. The important thing is just to make sure that those players that are affected with chakram react quickly, because if someone forgets to move, it's probably going to cause the chakram to hit, for maximum damage or close to maximum damage on the entire group that they're with. The next big ability is Phantasmal Winds. So for this, I'm just showing the same clip over and over because it's just kind of hard to see this in action, since as a tank, I don't really get targeted by it for the most part. So this will target 5 random raid members in the group. So to kind of see those players that are targeted, if you look in the top left unit frame, which is the Iskar Assist list of players, alphabetical players, you can watch to the right of their name. They will get a little blue wind debuff when the cast completes. You can see it next to 5 people there. And this indicates that those players are afflicted with Phantasmal Winds. Phantasmal Winds will start to push players toward the edge of the platform. And the longer the buff is out, the harder that pushback is. Just like most pushbacks that you've seen up to this point, you can push against it yourself to fight against that, to try to prevent yourself from getting pushed off too quickly. To get rid of Phantasmal Winds, the player must hold the Eye of Anzu for a moment. So as soon as they gain the Eye of Anzu buff, essentially, they will immediately have the winds dispelled from them. So this is one of the mechanics that requires passing the Eye of Anzu to different players to ensure that nobody gets pushed off the platform, because you can see in the back ledge there, you can just fall right off, which is what the debuff is trying to do. So to really illustrate how you actually remove the winds efficiently, how you manage it, I've taken just this clip and slowed it way, way down. And so this gives you a chance to really see the using of the Iskar Assist Addon and how passing the eye among the players that are afflicted with the wind quickly, going through them, removes the debuff from each of them in turn. So the goal is to get rid of this buff quickly. All 5 people get the eye passed to them, and then they pass it back to a default player, which is usually me as the tank. So here we're looping back. So if you watch as the wind cast is about to complete here from the boss, watch that frame on the top left, and you'll see the wind icon next to 5 people. So the first person in the list is Alun, our hunter, one of our hunters. So I click his name, I pass the eye to him. Now he lost the debuff, and you can see he's got the eye. Then it went to Blinks, Warlock. He immediately passed it to the next player in the list, Cutsman, which had it, and then Farrington, and then the final person, and now it's going back to me. So even, this is 25% speed, but even at the speed, you can see just how quickly it is that it's passed along, and that's ideal. And the reason that you can do this, and it's something to really drill into the heads of everyone in the raid, is that once an ability like Winds has been identified and the debuffs have gone out, if you are afflicted with it, so if you yourself are a victim, you need to look on the list, whatever order your raid uses, in this case alphabetical, and find the next person that is also afflicted with the debuff that has passed your name in the list. So in our case, in this rotation, the first person on the list that got it was Alun. He's actually the top on the list, so it's easy. And then 2 down from him, the next person after him was Blinks. So Alun is going to pass to Blinks. That's the next person down the list that is afflicted with the debuff. And the reason for this is that it speeds the process up. So Blinks does a great job of this in this particular clip, because you can see just how quickly, once Blinks gets his debuff removed, that the next person in the list, which is Cutsman, also gets his debuff removed. This means that Blinks is actually spam clicking on Cutsman's name in the add-on, even before he gains the Eye of Anzu buff. In fact, to really illustrate this, I've slowed it down even more. This is 10% normal speed, so you can see the frames. But I just want to illustrate the importance of this technique that Blinks is using here, and everyone in the raid should get in the habit of it. By spam clicking the next person on the list, the one you're supposed to pass it to, even before the eye is passed to you, you will then automatically pass it instantly once you receive it. So watch that list again. So I'm passing to Alun, and you can see Blinks is afflicted, and Cutsman is the next person afflicted after him. So as soon as Blinks' debuff goes away, watch how quickly it then debuffs, or gets rid of the debuff from Cutsman. There's Blinks, boom, there's Cutsman. So that's because, remember, this is 10% speed. Blinks is spamming the left click on the add-on on Cutsman's name, because he knows that he's going to pass it to Cutsman, and he wants to do so as soon as he gains the eye. So as soon as Alun, the first person on the list, passed it to Blinks, the second person, Blinks then instantly passes it to the following person on the list after him, which is Cutsman, that needs to have the debuff removed. So if everyone were to do this, obviously the initial person that's passing it to the first target will have to actually identify who the first in the list is, which is my role here in the footage. But if everyone else does this, they get in the habit of just identifying the next person past them if they're afflicted and spam clicking. It will go through the cycle of everyone just in a matter of a second or two, just really fast. And this ensures that there's almost no movement, no errors. It just doesn't take very much. So here we are in real time again, just to see it once again, there's me passing to the first person, blinks to Cutsman almost instantly. Cutsman takes a moment, then fourth to fifth, almost instant again, and then back to the original player. So the total process time using this method, and this is not perfect, but it's really quite efficient, 4 or 5 seconds to do the entire process, passing from the main holder, the tank in this case, through 5 wind people back to the tank. And so if your raid can get in the habit of doing this process, it will really help you stay alive and avoid screw-ups on this. Just like Phantasmal Winds, Phantasmal Wounds is another ability that is targeted on 5 random raid members. In this case, the wound does some initial damage, and then it also is a dot that will do pretty low damage every 2 seconds to the afflicted player while the dot is active. Removing Phantasmal Wounds can actually be done in 2 ways. Just like the winds, it can be removed by having the player gain the Eye of Anzu. As soon as the Eye of Anzu is on them, the wounds are instantly removed. However, you can also remove wounds by getting the player's health to above 90%. For the most part, there's really no reason to bother using the Eye of Anzu for this purpose. It complicates an ability that just simply doesn't require complication in that matter. It's far easier, even on Heroic, we found, to just heal the players up, just like you legitimately would. If people are not standing in something like fire that they shouldn't, there's very little damage that is unexpected, can't be accounted for, and therefore it's quite easy for healers to quickly heal everyone with this debuff up above 90% and remove it in that fashion. If you are shy on healers for some reason, or your output is not strong enough to efficiently deal with this, and you're seeing this persist into other phases or something like that, you absolutely can use the Eye of Anzu to do it, in which case you would perform the same in-order rotation of passing the eye, just like you did for the winds. The wounds and the winds are staggered from one another, so you do have time, but you have to be efficient. And it's critical, of course, that you finish the wound passing before the next winds ability goes off, because winds is far more dangerous since it pushes players out of range of other people. So just like the winds, if you get wounds and you use the eye, pass it to the first person on the list that needs the debuff removed, they'll pass it to the next person after them in the list, and spamming their name, so they're going to pass instantly, all the way down, once the last person has it removed, to pass it back to the main Eye of Anzu holder, again, usually the tank. The last main ability that we talk about is Fel Incineration, and this is cast on a random ranged player, so a ranged DPS or healer. After a short period, this will spawn a laser near their original location, but not exactly on top of them. And this distinction is critical. The laser will then chase them for a short duration, leaving a trail of fire on the ground. So there you can see the green laser kind of at the bottom of the screen. It's chasing someone and leaving fire trail in their path. So the basic idea here, as mentioned in the positionings diagram, and the reason that you have your ranged stacked up but not in melee, is to deal with this laser. So one of them will be randomly targeted, and that player will run the laser to one side. So if your ranged are going to the left for Chakram, which ours are doing, toward green, then you want to run the laser behind you or to the right. The first person that was targeted by laser in this particular kill went left. They screwed up. There's no other way to say it. That was incorrect. And so it means that there's a fire trail going from the left side, which means people will sometimes have to pass through it to run the Chakram out or something like that. But anyway, just come up with a pattern that your raid can use. We also learned after this footage was taken, a decent technique is to start the ranged, stacked up on one another, and when one player gets the laser and they move out to the side, so they move to the right, the rest of the range group take a step or two to the left, just a little bit, and this will position them outside of the danger of that initial laser. So even if it offset spawns right, on top of people, that's not going to hit them with fire. Over the course of the fight, there will be a number of fire lines that will be active at any given time. This ability is used during the second phase of the fight, so basically throughout the entire duration of the fight, you will be targeted with this. So it's critical that you are not afraid to adjust your range positions to ensure that this is dealt with properly. After a short time, the fire that had spawned for a particular cast will despawn, so you won't fill up the entire room. Eventually, you'll start to be able to reuse space that was otherwise blocked off from fire. So the important thing is just to get in the habit of keeping your range close to one another, and when one player is afflicted, they run out of the raid, generally to the opposite side that your chakram is going. And then once space clears up in a particular area, loop back around to that position. The entire range group needs to be there so that you're not cutting people off, and everyone can stick together. Now, 3 times throughout the fight, at various health percentages on the boss will exit and the add phase will begin. And the add phases are similar to one another, but each of them adds a new single add type that will complicate the future add phase a little bit more. In addition to that, the boss uses a few basic abilities throughout these phases that you also have to deal with. So the primary ability that you're dealing with that you haven't seen in the other phase is the Focused Blast cast. This is actually done by the boss, who's floating in the background, essentially, off the platform. There you can see the blast graphic just pass over the screen. This will basically be a long cast time ability, and when it completes, it will target the player that's holding the Eye of Anzu at the time and hit that player and anyone within a straight line for a huge amount of damage, but this damage is split among everybody that's in line. So if the Eye of Anzu player is off to the side by themselves, they'll get one shot. But if they are in line relative to the boss's position with the rest of the raid, then it will split the damage and everyone will be fine. So the general rule of thumb during these phases is to make sure the raid is roughly front to back along this central corridor here. And no matter which player is holding the eye, which should only be one of basically 2 people during these phases, we'll talk about that in a moment, it will still cause the focused blast line effect to pass over the majority of the raid and not really threaten anyone. So just keep in mind, whoever has the Eye of Anzu needs to be in a line with the majority of the raid, and people should try to stay along the central corridor when possible. Now, during each add phase, including the first one, you'll always get a set of 6 outcasts, which are just little tiny mobs that need to be tanked. They don't do anything special, they just melee the tank. So these are always going to be there in every add phase, so I'm not going to talk about them anymore after this. The main thing for each add phase is the single large add type. And in the first add phase, you have to deal with the corrupted Talonpriest. He's the only special add that is in this first phase. The Talonpriest will use an ability called Phantasmal Fel Beam fairly frequently, and this will debuff 5 random raid members. These players will have a 5-second Fel Beam debuff. After the 5 seconds expires, the bomb will detonate, and it will deal pretty heavy damage to the player and anyone within about 5 yards of their location. However, the cool part about this is that because these are phantasmal Fel Beams, they're technically fake. One of the 5 players, however, will randomly be targeted with a real Fel Beam, not a phantasmal version. However, the only way to identify which one is the real one, the non-phantasmal one, is for the player with the Eye of Anzu to see who it is. If that player is a healer, they can dispel the Fel Beam, which is green in color. The phantasmal ones are red in color, if you're looking at your debuffs. And once they've identified who that is, like I said, they can dispel the Fel Beam, the normal one, and upon dispelling it, it will remove all Fel Beams across the raid, all phantasmal Fel Beams, so there won't be any explosions. So, just to reiterate, the goal here is to get the Eye of Anzu onto a healer player, someone that can dispel when this ability is cast. That player can then identify who has the actual Fel Beam on them within the 5-second window before they detonate, dispel that player manually, And once they're dispelled, all Phantasmal Fel Bombs will be removed from the raid. So the way to get in the habit of handling this is to pick one healer in the raid team that can be the designated dispeller to receive the eye before this ability is cast, quickly identify who's getting dispelled, dispel them, and then pass it back to the tank that's holding the Eye of Anzu primarily. So for our team, as mentioned, I'm the default holder. So for the most part, I'm holding the eye throughout the fight. And just before the Talonpriest is about to cast that ability, or as he's casting it, I'll pass it to our designated healer, which is Volts, the monk healer in our team. And he will dispel the identified player. And once he's dispelled, he quickly passes it back to me as the default holder. And this pattern, hold the main tank holder of the eye, going to the priest dispeller, or excuse me, the healer dispeller, and back to that tank, is critical for future phases. So you might as well get used to doing it in this phase as well. And we'll talk about those phases in a moment. So just get used to that pattern, pass it to the healer as the cast is going out or just before it goes out. They will hold it until they dispel, then they'll pass it back to the tank. The second add phase begins at 45% health, and in addition to the lesser adds, the Talonpriest, you'll also get one new special add called the Warden. This Warden, his only ability is Fel Conduit. This has a short cast time, and it's interruptible. If it's allowed to cast, he will then channel for a 10-second period, I believe it is, ticks of chain Fel Lightning, essentially, that will hit raid members and chain between them, doing tons of damage to the raid, possibly wiping you if you certainly let the whole thing go off. To prevent this from happening, you need to have someone interrupt the Fel Conduit, either the initial cast before he starts channeling, or once he's actually begun channeling, you can also interrupt that. However, to interrupt it, the player that's interrupting has to have the Eye of Anzu buff on them active at the time. So, for this reason, this is the first reason that you're generally using the pattern of one of the tanks as being the default Eye of Anzu holder, which is what I'm doing in this case. That way, that tank can always be ready for that Fel Conduit cast, interrupt it, and then you can deal with the other phase mechanic, which is the spell from the assigned healer dealing with the Talonpriest ability. The timing of these abilities, how they cast one after the other, is critical. The Warden will always use Fel Conduit first before the Talonpriest uses his bomb ability. So it means that the debuff needs to default be on the tank. That tank is ready to interrupt the Warden. And once that interrupt has occurred, that tank quickly passes it to the assigned healer, who then deals with the bombs. So you can see the bombs going out. And then he's dispelling. And he passes it back to me. Now there's the Fel Conduit cast shortly after. I interrupt that. And this process just repeats over and over. In the second add phase, when you have just the Warden and the Talonpriest active, in addition to keeping the buff or the Eye of Anzu defaulted on the tank that's interrupting, your DPS should prioritize the Talonpriest as their target. The reason for this is that once the Talonpriest dies, you have no reason to pass the eye from the primary holder, from the tank, other than the debuff stack, which we'll talk about later. But for the most part, once the Talonpriest is dead, you can just keep the Eye of Anzu on that tank, and they can just always be ready to interrupt. So the Warden can technically survive well past the end of the add phase. Once the boss comes back down, the Warden can still be active, which he is in this clip here, and that's perfectly fine. You can then kill him off when it's convenient to do so, because the tank is still going to be able to interrupt every cast. So finally, when the boss hits 20% health, we'll enter the third add phase. You'll get the lesser adds, the Talonpriest, the Warden, and then the final new special add is the Fel Raven. The Raven's ability is Phantasmal Corruption, and it will attempt to debuff the current player that has threat, so whoever's tanking the Raven. And if this player is debuffed, they will emit Phantasmal Nova, which basically does pretty heavy fire damage to anyone within about 10 yards. And anyone hit by this will also gain a cremation debuff, which increases the damage they take from fire with every stack. However, just like all the other special add abilities, if the current tank that is targeted by Phantasmal Corruption from the Fel Raven has Eye of Anzu, that player, he or she, will be immune to the application. And therefore, it's all the more reason that we've been practicing keeping the Eye of Anzu on one of the tanks as the default holder of the ability. Because once you enter this third and final add phase, it's critical that the tank with threat on the on the Fel Raven is holding the Eye of Anzu, preventing that application of Phantasmal Corruption. So to give you an idea of how these abilities and casts overlap, here you can see on screen I've taken a snippet of the logs from Phase 3. So we have the timestamp on the left, the actual event. So Shadow Escape is the start of the phase, cast by the boss. And then the 3 core abilities from the adds, the Fel Conduit from the Warden, the Obliteration from the Talonpriest, and the Corruption from the Fel Raven. And then we have the elapsed column, which shows how much time in seconds from the start of the phase that a particular ability was cast, or that event was cast. And then the last 3 columns show the time from the prior ability of that same type, if there was one. So this shows you that the time between conduits and corruptions is 16 seconds each time. Give or take a little variance, but that's just from logging and stuff. They have a cooldown of 16 seconds. The Obliteration, on the other hand, is about 18, or a little over that. Its cooldown, mostly about 18. So what this means is as a particular add phase progresses, the second add phase and then the third add phase, where you have more than just the Talonpriest active, the offset of time difference between the Talonpriest's ability and the other 2 abilities, Conduit and Corruption, the offset of 3.5 seconds will get closer and closer together, such that eventually they will overlap, and you will not be able to deal with all of them before there is some overlap, and the eye has to be in 2 places at once, essentially. This generally will occur around the 4th cast of the Phantasmal Obliteration from an active Talonpriest. So the 3rd one you can still do legitimately. If you get the 3rd cast from the Talonpriest in a phase to go off, you can still handle that normally. It's just the healer that dispels has to be quick to identify the person, dispel, pass back to the tank, and that tank, of course, has to be quick to interrupt the Warden, the conduit that's coming up shortly thereafter. But you can do it fast enough on the 3rd cast. But the 4th one, you're probably not going to have time to do it. And that will essentially mean that not only will you get Fel Conduit ticking a little bit before an interrupt is actually able to go out because of the delay. And more importantly, it means if you're in the 3rd and final add phase, you will also have a Corruption cast applied to the tank. And this is because if you look at the elapsed time, in the 3rd phase here, the Conduit from the Warden and the Corruption from the Raven are cast pretty much simultaneously. They're offset a little bit, but because they have the same cooldown, because they're cast pretty much at the same time, you can effectively assume that they're going off at the same time. This is all the more reason that it's critical that your default holder of the eye is that tank, and that tank is the one that is holding or keeping threat on the Raven, so that in the 3rd phase, that tank has the eye. When the conduit is being cast by the Warden and the tank is interrupting, that tank already has threat on the Raven and is therefore immune to the corruption that's going off at basically the same time. So hopefully this diagram or this table gives you an idea of the timings that are going on, but the goal here, because of this offset with the Talonpriest, is to always make sure the DPS focus the Talonpriest as their primary target. Once the Talonpriest is dealt with and killed, the Warden and the Fel Raven can effectively be active indefinitely at that point, so long as the eye is able to remain on the tank that has threat on the Raven. When those abilities are cast, it doesn't really matter because the eye will be on the person that it needs to be. Now that said, if you leave them up after the boss comes back down, so you've entered the 3rd phase, you've dealt with the Talonpriest, boss comes back down as active, and now you get a a round of winds, the normal ground phase ability, well, now you're in trouble, because you can't afford to be passing that around for the winds management at the same time that your tank needs to have it active to be immune to corruption or to interrupt the Warden. So even though the Talonpriest is the primary target for all the reasons mentioned, your DPS still need to actively focus and kill the adds in these add phases before you spend too much time in the normal phase and the boss is active again. And before I forget, I should also mention that the third add phase is the ideal time to use Bloodlust and blow all your remaining DPS cooldowns. This is going to be the most intense moment of the fight by far. So it's critical that your raid is able to get most of the adds down before the boss returns. And this will just make it a lot easier to deal with everything that's going on. So don't be afraid to hold on to cooldowns just so you're ready to burst as much as possible in this third add phase, even if that means skipping them on the add phase prior or something like that. The final mechanic to discuss is Radiance of Anzu, which is a stacking debuff that will apply every 2 seconds and deal damage every 2 seconds to the player that's currently holding the Eye of Anzu during the fight. So I've mentioned this in passing a few times throughout the guide. The basic idea here is just it's stacking damage that your raid has to deal with, and you sometimes need to manage this stack by passing the eye to multiple people. So while the Eye of Anzu is active, as mentioned, every 2 seconds you gain a stack. Each stack will cause that player to take 25,000 fire damage per stack every 2 seconds on heroic anyway. It's 18,000 or so on normal, but still it goes up quite a bit. Now for every tick that occurs when you do not have the Eye of Anzu, you will lose a stack. So if you're at 10 stacks and you pass the eye to someone else, it will take you 10 ticks, which is about 20 seconds, to drop your stacks from 10, 9, 8, and all the way down and get rid of them. So with that in mind, when you sort of default the eye holding to one of the tanks, which is, the primary Fel Raven tank, the tank that will end up being the Fel Raven tank, but generally just the one tank that's dealing with most of these mechanics, you need to watch that tank's stack count of Radiance, because over time, particularly if you're really efficient about doing other stuff, that tank's stack count is going to go really high. So looking at our logs for this particular kill, of the damage that I took as the tank, 70%, a little over 70% of it, of my damage taken in the fight, was purely from Radiance. That's a ridiculous amount. And of course, it's magic damage, so you might want to plan around that accordingly. Having your tank that's good at this stuff, especially if they're good with magic reduction, is ideal. But anyway, the point is, once your stack reaches a dangerous amount on that tank, find an opportune time and pass the eye to someone else. So our typical method for doing this is when there's nothing else going on, say we've just dealt with a winds or something like that in the normal phase, and we know we're not going to have to deal with the eye passing for a while, we'll have it passed to the other tank. So you can see here, well, it's hard to see, but right now, after the winds was dealt with, it's passed to our tank, other tank in the raid, which is Dougal. So he just holds it for a while so that my stack count can drop. Similarly, at least in the early add phase, the first and second add phases, when I've interrupted the conduit, I will immediately pass it to our healer who's doing the dispels from the Talonpriest obliteration. There's no reason to wait for that to cast or to get closer. So the faster that tank passes it to the healer that's going to do the dispelling, the fewer stacks that tank will take. So ideally you want to keep it off the tank as much as possible, because later on through most of the fight, ground phase and all that, the tank's going to get a lot of stacks. So it's okay to let the particular healer hold it for a couple extra ticks and, use this time to keep the stack count low on the tank when possible. So finally, we'll do the wrap up with the overview tips for DPS. The priority in this fight is always the Talonpriest needs to die first. The Warden is second priority, Raven is third, and finally anything else, lesser adds, and then the boss, of course. When you get Fel Chakram, make sure you quickly run out toward your assigned role position. So ranged DPS will have one position for all the ranged. The other position for melee will be in a different position. So you run to that spot, Chakram gets thrown, bounces between all three players and back to the boss. If you're using the Iskar Assist Addon, which I highly recommend, check the description. When you get afflicted by Phantasmal Winds, make sure you quickly identify in the list the next player after your own name that is afflicted with winds, and start spam left-clicking their name. This will cause you to instantly pass the eye to that player once you receive it yourself, and this will make the passing overall very efficient and quick. If you're the final person in the list that's afflicted, you're the last one to get the eye, no one else needs it, just pass it back to the assigned eye tank, which your raid will have one. For range DPS, when you get Fel Beam Fixate on you, make sure you quickly run out of the raid to the right if you're using the same positioning we are here, and kite the laser away. If you're not fixated when that's cast, everyone else just moves slightly to the left just to get out of the fire. So to review the specifics for tanks on this fight, again, like everyone, when you get Chakram on you, which means you were the current boss tank at the time when the ability was cast, you want to run out to your assigned Chakram position. In our case, it's to the right for the tanks toward red. The other tank needs to quickly taunt off you. This is when you tank swap on the boss for the most part. If you're the Eye of Anzu tank, a lot of the success of this fight will come down to you, and you need to be able to handle this management easily by keeping track of everything that's going on. So the first thing is when Phantasmal Winds is cast, quickly identify the first afflicted player with this debuff, pass it to the first person in the list that gets it. They will pass through the entire raid, getting rid of the buffs, and then it'll come back to you. During every add phase for the Eye of Anzu tank, make sure you interrupt Fel Conduit, which is cast by the Warden, and then quickly pass the eye to the assigned Fel Bomb healer, the healer that's going to dispel that ability. To help you with interrupting, I found it's easy to focus the Warden when it initially pops out, and then use an interrupt casting macro for your interrupt ability that will prioritize your focus target if you have one. If you want to know the details of that macro and how you can use it yourself, it's in the description of the video under the tank tips section. During ad phase number 3 in particular, the Eye of Anzu tank needs to make sure that you maintain threat on the Fel Raven mob. The other mobs don't actually matter. You don't need threat on the Warden to interrupt it, of course. You don't need to worry about threat on the Raven or even the little guys. But it's critical that the Eye of Anzu tank retains threat on the Raven so that when it casts Corruption on you, you will be immune to the ability because you'll have the Eye of Anzu. Otherwise, you interrupt the Warden just like normal and pass it along to the healer as you've done for previous phases. And then finally, tips for healers in this fight. Just like the rest of the raid, when you get Chakram, make sure you run out to your assigned Chakram position. It's the same position as ranged DPS, in our case to the left of the ranged group. If you're using Iskar Assist Addon, which I highly recommend, when you are afflicted with Phantasmal Winds, look in the list of players and identify the next person after your own name that is also afflicted with the debuff. Start spam left-clicking on that person so that when you get the eye, you'll automatically pass it to them right away and just get through the list quickly. If you're the last person in the list and you get the eye, pass it back to the assigned Eye of Anzu tank. If you are the Fel Bomb healer, of which there will be one in the raid, make sure you can quickly identify once the cast completes and you get the eye on you, which player needs to be dispelled of their Fel Bomb. There will only be one of them, and it's a green icon. Once you've dispelled it, you can pass it back to the Eye of Anzu tank. And if you are using the Iskar Assist Addon, you can right-click on someone's name to attempt to dispel them. So you don't need to worry about using your other raid frames or anything like that to find the proper player to dispel. You can just right-click on the name in that add-on. So, believe it or not, that is everything really for Shadow Lord Iskar. It's overall not all that difficult of an encounter. Most of it just comes down to the ability for your raid to effectively pass around the eye for Phantasmal Winds. And again, the add-on helps a lot with that. Once people get that down, the success really just comes down to one of your tanks, one of your healers, And then everything else is pretty standard fare for encounters, focusing on the right priority targets for DPS and standing in basic positions and stuff like that. As always, good luck. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. If you're willing to subscribe, then I would really appreciate it. In fact, I'll invite you over for dinner. I'll roast up a juicy Arakoa for us, and I might even defeather it beforehand, which really makes it go down a lot better, honestly. And the feathers are great for tickling afterward. Oh yeah.